Are you ready for an impossible question? Who is the best Survivor player ever? Not most entertaining or most important, just the best at playing the game. Trust me, it is a hard question, and there are many up for contention. To me, these top players all have arguments for being crowned the best. So let's go through each case and ask the question, are they the best Survivor? A Survivor villain, a title that has been thrown around a lot, probably to a lot of undeserving people. To me, a villain is someone who's more than just a semi-annoying presence, or has a few biting confessionals. Now, to me, a Survivor villain is, ironically, the truest essence of the game Survivor. Someone out there not to make friends or play with honor. Someone out there just to win, and win by any means necessary, to the point their ruthlessness and lack of any empathy oozes through the television. Not a shred of integrity fills their Machiavellian hearts, only the perpetual drive to defeat everyone else and get that million. So, is it any surprise that maybe the most villainous player we have ever seen can also be called one of the best players we have ever seen? A man who, the first days on the island, called his future Survivor game nothing more than a business trip. Someone who many have called a sociopath on screen. A winner with blood as cool as ice. Brian Heidik.
Mr. Freeze is in the house, even though it's about 110 out here.
But hey, before we talk about Brian Heidik the player, let's talk about Brian Heidik the TV character. In any discussion about the Iceman, you will have someone go, Brian is one of the best ever, but I hated watching him, he's just too awful. I just want to say, as much as I admire Brian the player, I admire Brian the character even more, to the point he's one of my favorites just off of entertainment value. Now, I'm not going to call him a sociopath or actually evil. I think it's a very rude and cocky thing to say about someone I only know through an edited TV show. But Brian feels like he's straight out of American Psycho. He has this great anti-charisma to him that makes every moment on screen so disconcerting it's funny. His monotone, awkward inflection, his corny 80s zingers, and obsession with calling himself ice cold. One of my favorite moments on the show is him trying to make his alliance with a bunch of middle-aged, unthreatening tribe-mates sound cool.
I've got 3 pieces of ammunition I can use. 1, I've got my trump card. Jan.
Looking good on that black.
And of course, even if it was by accident, him getting arrested later for shooting a dog with a bow is equally sad and hilariously on brand. I mean, I could keep going, but there's a player to analyze in Brian as well, because all of that in-game sociopathy makes for an incredible mind for Survivor. Richard Hatch, Survivor's first winner, laid out how to win the game. Make an alliance, enter the merge with the numbers, maneuver to the end, and gain a majority of the jury votes. A simple formula that creates the standard dominant winner, what many would call the average way to win Survivor. Although in modern seasons such a simple path is obscured by innumerable twists and turns. But still, for most Survivors, that was the game almost all competent players tried to replicate, with maybe some personal flair or additional strength here or there. Brian figured this winning formula out and perfected it. In Survivor Season 5 Thailand, he led his alliance on the Choigon tribe, won enough challenges to enter the merge with numbers, maneuvered to the final 2, and won the jury vote. Mind you, he was not an avid watcher of the show who applied. Brian was recruited by production to see how a slimy car salesman type would fare on the show. And unsurprisingly, Brian played incredibly, because he had the physical build, strategic chops, and most importantly, psychology for the game that ensures he has an excellent chance of winning in many conditions. For forming and maintaining an alliance, we will get to this in more detail later, but Brian's car salesman talent comes in handy. Just by physicality alone, Brian has a low chance of going out pre-merge. He is a provider and challenge competitor, 2 skills very much prized in the pre-merge. But furthermore, Brian knew how to make himself appear likable to anybody, and just like selling a car, how to sell them on an alliance. Even further, Brian had everyone convinced he was their number 2. In a new and revolutionary strategy in Survivor history, where most of the time Survivors expected themselves to keep their prized final 2 deals sacred, Brian just made as many final 2 deals as necessary. Socially, everyone trusted Brian to somehow believe they were the chosen one Heidik was not lying to, and strategically this means Brian has every door open to him come the late game. All of the Choigons by the merge trusted Brian with all the information they held, and thus all roads led to Brian. I will go later into how sustainable this social game is in the jury section, but for now understand that in-game, Brian always had his alliance completely in check. To make sure that the alliance actually has the chance of getting to the end, you must win challenges to make sure your tribe stays strong and enters the merge with numbers. Thus, players who provide for their tribe and can win challenges are highly valued in pre-merge. Brian does this easily. He can feed his tribe in order to strengthen them, and more noticeably, is an incredible challenge performer. Now, Brian does not have 5 immunities or lead a tribe that never loses, but any who has watched Thailand can see just how much Brian contributed to Choigon's wins. Brian ended up with the short end of the stick in terms of tribe members, pitted against the young athletic Sukchai. Yet still, Brian carried his team to a simple majority. If he could do it with the Choigon geriatrics, that proves he will be one of the most valuable players on a pre-merge tribe and get them to a majority. Going from the beginning of the merge to the final immunity challenge, Brian has a great shot at getting to the end, for the exact reasons we have just listed. Many people will trust Brian to the end and get him to the final two. If they do sense he's a threat, Brian has an excellent mind for the game. He'll learn about the plot to take them out through one of his allies and then respond with an ice-cold murder by pitting his numbers against the enemy. And if all else fails, Brian is a top-tier physical threat. He won the last 3 challenges in a row. All of these strengths mean Brian had a very certain chance at ending up in the Thailand Final 2, no matter what. Now, onto arguably the most important part of the game, and a possible chink in Brian's armor. Any discussing him have to discuss. The jury section. In Survivor Thailand, Brian Heidik, the legendary all-controlling player, won by 1 vote over fellow finalist Clay, who is widely regarded as one of the weakest finalists ever. In addition, it is argued that Clay is Brian's only winning combination. That means against anyone else on that jury, Brian loses. Is this really the mark of the best player, where his path to victory is so narrow that 1 rogue jury vote or fumbled immunity challenge means the end of Brian Heidik? In his defense, there is a few points to make. 1. Clay is a much better player than people give him credit for. Clay, may he rest in peace, goes down as an all-around weak and socially inept player by the community, when in fact Clay was playing very well, probably second only to Brian. Sure, Clay was not particularly respected by his original Choigon tribe, but during the merge, Clay made solid relationships with the minority Sukchai alliance, which later earned him their 3 jury votes, which he probably still earns in other combinations with several other Choigon members. So no, Clay's 3 votes are not due to a subpar game by Brian, but an underrated game by Clay. Secondly, Brian knows anyone else but Clay can beat him, so he innovates. Heidik is credited with pioneering the GOAT strategy in Survivor. Essentially, the GOAT strategy is allying with the weakest jury threats at the end. Brian knew he has to worry about who he sits against, so he changes the game and picks the exact right person to go to the end with. That really says something more about the Iceman's brilliant mind for the game. Finally, so what if it's a narrow path for Brian? What matters is how well he played that path. Brian set up his endgame so sure it was razor thin, but still completely obtainable by him. Like sure, someone could beat him at the final immunity challenge, but look at his competition. Brian made certain to eliminate the people from his tribe who have a chance challenge-wise. Jan could have won immunity, but what are the chances this little old lady beats Brian? And at the final tribal council, Brian knew the exact number of jurors he had to get to beat Clay, and focused all of his energies on them. He basically disregarded Clay's 3 jury votes during tribal council.
Brian, do you know where I grew up?
And instead knew what really mattered were the other 4. All 4 Brian knew, even if he backstabbed them, had much more reason to vote him over Clay. And yet was only 4, but last time I checked, 4 to Clay's 3 is all you need. A winner who wins unanimously or with the bare minimum gets the exact same outcome at the end of the day. Maybe an analogy can help. Imagine watching a super flashy slam dunk by an NBA player. Sure, you can criticize how if they're off by a fraction of a second in any of the countless muscle movements they have to make, they'll fail miserably. But the fact is they didn't. They did everything exactly how it needed to be, and that makes them great dunkers. Same for Heidik. Sure, it was razor-thin margins, but him so effortlessly staying in between those margins is what makes it impressive. So there's Brian's incredible path to solving the Survivor winner formula. He followed the steps to win to the T, had the strengths to accomplish it, and boom, legendary Survivor winner. But to me, Brian does not stand out as just the winner of Thailand. One of his great traits is he could be the winner of many, many seasons. One of the definitions of best player I've seen floated around is the player who, if you were to put them in 100 random newbie seasons, would win the most. And Brian has a very strong case under this definition. Many other great players and their unique styles of winning can arguably only work as well as they did in the context of their season. But Brian played essentially the textbook definition of a winning game of Survivor in a season with no humongous twists that benefited him with what I would call an average cast in terms of competition. Put Brian in 100 random seasons and he probably wins a lot of them. Now, I want to focus on one strength in particular that I think makes Brian so potent to end this video. Because yeah, he's a challenge beast and a mastermind, but Brian socially has an incredible one-of-a-kind trait. It's the trait that made him so trustworthy to other players when on our screens he just appeared to be a sleaze. See, many successful players had the luck of gelling with their numbers. By chance, their personalities were ones that made them livable to a key ally or powerful alliance. That's a core part of the social experiment in Survivor. The elements and starvation mean at some point your true colors will always show, and will determine your fate in the game. This is what producers Mark Burnett, host Jeff Probst, and even psychologists claim was the unbreakable rule of Survivor. Your real personality will always show. And then season 5 comes along and Brian just breaks it. He was a different person to everyone he talked to. He could be your brother, your drinking friend, your teacher, and you'd never meet the real him. Brian always adjusted, morphed to a personality that gave him the edge at the moment before effortlessly contorting into something else just a moment later. After the show, the contestants would come home to watch the television and just be stunned at how different Heidik was in confessionals. "That's not the Brian we know," they would say. If there's any one person who can claim to have broke Survivor, it's Brian. Unlike other legends, he did more than come up with new strategies or win a ton of challenges. He didn't just change Survivor, he perfected it. Survivor Thailand is commonly cited as one of the worst seasons the show has ever seen, for many reasons, but maybe most importantly, its winner, Brian Heidik. With little knowledge of the show, this reviled, loathsome, borderline sociopath strode on our televisions to earn a quick buck, meanwhile dismantling the season and one of the very principles of the social experiment. Brian is quite possibly the best survivor, and best villain, because he didn't just defeat his fellow players, he defeated the game.
What skills come into play at this part of the game? Skating skills.